Welcome, everybody, to another lecture in the lecture series provided to you by the Chair in Transgender Studies. I'm really pleased that you could join us. My name is Aaron DeVore, and I am the founder of the Chair in Transgender Studies, the Transgender Archives, and the Moving Trans History Forward conferences, all of which you just saw a little bit about in our video. So we're at the University of Victoria. We start with a territorial acknowledgement. We acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen people on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Our work is to provide inspiration and hope to trans plus people and our allies everywhere. And we try to do this by contributing to the development and the communication of accurate, research-based, real-world knowledge about trans plus people. And we want to see that used to build a better world with better policies and laws and to drive social change. We also work to help build strong and resilient trans plus communities, and we do that through cultural activities, arts and social activities, and in all that we do. We're committed to applying an intersectional lens in our work to advance reconciliation, racial justice, equity, and inclusion for all. So in addition to events like today, we do a lot of other things. I mentioned, you saw in the video, world's largest transgender archives, and we'll be hearing a little bit about that, I think, in today's talk. We put on the international, interdisciplinary, and intergenerational Moving Trans History Forward conferences every 2 years, so please save the date. That's coming up in March, at the end of March 2025. We've got scholarships for UVic students, fellowships for people to come visit, and lots of arts and cultural events. All right, so now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Cam Cannon is a doctoral candidate in American Studies at George Washington University and a 2024-2025 ACLS Mellon Dissertation Innovation Fellow. Their dissertation is called Standard: Trans Activism and the History of Gender-Affirming Care in the U.S. And it is a cultural, institutional, and political history of the diagnostic criteria and treatment protocols around gender-affirming care in the U.S., with particular emphasis on how trans people have worked to variously support, resist, and influence medical guidelines. So Cam Cannon is going to speak today on subject, expert, worker, source material, the tangled positionalities of trans facilitators of gender-affirming care in the 1960s and 1970s. So I welcome Cam Cannon.
Thank you so much, Dr. DeVore, for your introduction, and thank you to all of you for being here today. The topic for today's talk was inspired by my broader research into how trans people in the U.S. have related to various forms of medicalization and barriers to accessing gender-affirming care from roughly the 1960s onwards. One of the first things I realized upon embarking on this research was that there has been a huge diversity of thought, motivation, social positionality, political commitments among trans people in the U.S. over this time period, including among those who shared an earnest desire to make gender-affirming care more accessible and more equitable. In this presentation, I'm going to offer some thoughts on how 3 different trans-led organizations in the 60s and 70s conceptualized transness and related to the medical establishment. These organizations are the Erickson Educational Foundation, based in Baton Rouge in New York City, as well as a lot of other places, but that's for another talk. Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, based in New York City, and the National Transsexual Counseling Unit, based in San Francisco. By placing these 3 organizations in conversation with one another, I hope to both demonstrate the wide range of motivations and positions operative at the time, and gesture towards some of the ways in which systems of power, like racialization, classism, sexism, may have shaped differing approaches and understandings. This presentation will not provide an exhaustive overview of any one of these organizations, but rather touch on a few archival objects and offer some thoughts on how they might help us reflect on trans organizing and intellectual history vis-a-vis gender-affirming care. Okay, so we'll start with Reed Erickson, who is pictured here, whose collection I'm diving into this week here at the Transgender Archives in Victoria. So for those of you who don't know, the Erickson Educational Foundation archives are here, and they're very, very rich. And I'm excited to be deep in all those files, learning more about Erickson. For those that are not familiar, Erickson was a trans man, a millionaire, and philanthropist who inherited a large fortune from his father's business, which he then built upon with his own companies and investments. Erickson was able to access some degree of gender-affirming care as early as the 1950s and seemed to enjoy some degree of acceptance and support from his family of origin throughout his life. In the early 1960s, Erickson became an endocrinology patient of Dr. Harry Benjamin, the famous transsexuality researcher and author of the 1966 book, The Transsexual Phenomenon. In 1964, Erickson incorporated the Erickson Educational Foundation, which I'll refer to for the rest of this presentation as the EEF. The EEF was a wide-ranging philanthropic organization that, among other projects, devoted a lot of time and energy towards research about and expanding access to gender-affirming care. And I should mention at this point that a lot of what I know about about Reed Erickson, comes from Dr. DeVore's own scholarship. Those of us who are interested in this will have noticed there's a real dearth of secondary scholarship about Erickson, which is strange considering the large impact he had in so many areas. So hopefully, with this wonderful access to the archives, some more folks will be looking into Erickson. So throughout the 1960s and 70s, the EEF funded work by a number of well-known researchers of transsexuality, most of whom were cisgender themselves, including John Money, Richard Green, and Benjamin. The EEF also published a large number of educational pamphlets about transsexuality directed both at trans people and various professional classes, such as clergy, law enforcement, medical professionals, as well as a newsletter and a referral service that connected people across the US to doctors in their area willing to offer some form of gender-affirming care. So I'm still in the process of trying to track down archival evidence of Erickson's own conceptualization of transness and his motivation for his philanthropy. Now, before I came to Victoria, it was really difficult to find evidence of Erickson's own thoughts about these issues. He was what many people would describe as eccentric, and for that reason, you have a lot of people talking about their impressions of him, but it's actually pretty difficult to find things from Erickson's own perspective. And of course, I have more access to that now that I'm here in Victoria, but I did more or less finish this presentation before I came here. So the next few quotes I'm going to show you are the kind of glimmers of Erickson that I was able to find in my research prior to coming here. So the first quote that we're going to look at comes from the Proceedings of the Second Interdisciplinary Symposium on Gender Dysphoria, specifically the foreword to that, which was written by Erickson. This was a pretty influential, important conference taking place at Stanford University, and the EEF was the primary funder of this conference. So in this, let me move a couple things out of the way here so I can, here we go. In this foreword, Erickson says, "Now that we have all seen the hopeless, depressed person with the unsolvable gender identity problem bloom forth happily and fit into the more normal matrix of society, professionals are encouraged to lend a helping hand, which will relieve society of a dependent, alienated subject. The transsexual, thus, not only may fulfill himself, but also contribute to society." So there's a few things from this quote I want to point out. On one level, we see Erickson demonstrating a conceptualization of gender-affirming care as a means of self-realization, of authenticity, of livability, all things that I think will resonate here in 2024. There's also another layer of his comment that I want to talk about, however, and that is the way in which Erickson describes access to gender-affirming care as a means of ensuring greater social cohesion and overall economic health. Gender-affirming care was a means for trans people to cease being, quote, dependent alienated subjects and instead become productive contributors to society. Erickson's vision of the social potential of gender-affirming care mirrored that of his doctor and recipient of a lot of EEF funding, Harry Benjamin. In a 1971 newsletter from EEF, Benjamin is quoted as saying that, as a result of gender-affirming care, valuable lives have been salvaged and miserable, ineffectual men have become reasonably well-adjusted women, and vice versa. In this way, not only an individual, but also society has been served. In both Erickson and Benjamin's statements, we see an emphasis on salvaged potential, on the transformation of what would have been ineffectual or draining economic subjects, unhappy trans people without access to gender-affirming care, to reasonably well-adjusted, economically productive members of society. This framing of care as a means of improving general social cohesion, as well as a history of pathologizing the supposed non-productivity of trans people, is a feature of early sexological discussions of transness that many contemporary scholars have dissected and discussed. If you are interested in like a particular corner of this, it's something I'm extremely interested in. So if you want to shoot me an email with, for more specific recommendations, I might be able to help you on that front. But if you're looking for an overview of what I'm talking about, I really recommend this article from Dan Irving. And in this article, Irving talks a lot about the history of trans people being portrayed as kind of social parasites and how that interacts with racialization, class discrimination, sexuality, et cetera. So if that's something you want to dive more into, I recommend it. And of course, I'll go back to Erickson's comment here if I can. Looking at this quote from Erickson, I don't mean to say that he has fully bought into this, vision of parasitism or anything like that. I don't think we have enough evidence of Erickson's own words to really say that. But what I am pointing out is that more his vision of gender-affirming care as serving not just a function for the individual, but a societal function of greater cohesion and productivity. Okay, the next archival glimmer of Erickson that I want to talk about has to do with the relationship between transmasculinity, transfemininity, and productivity. This piece of the archive comes from the transcripts of the 1969 First International Symposium on Gender Identity, held in London and funded primarily by the EEF and the Albany Trust out of the UK. Erickson's quote comes from the Q&A section of a talk by British physician Dr. Peter Scott titled Clinical Aspects and Introduction. Before I get into what Scott said, a little note here regarding the language. In 1969, much of the academic and research literature on transsexuality featured trans women as the paradigmatic trans patient. Trans women were referred to as male transsexuals and trans men as either female transsexuals or genetic women. A lot of the language and ideas here might be considered, more commonly offensive from a 2024 standpoint, but were relatively par for the course and unexceptional in the academic transsexuality world of 1969. So to be clear, I'm not saying that there were no people around in 1969 who would have balked at Scott's argument, but they were not likely to be in the Piccadilly Hotel at this particular conference. So Scott's argument in his talk is basically that trans women are trans because they have experienced a failure to compete in the sexual marketplace of reproduction and subsequently adopted a passive female social role to cope with this evolutionary failure in Scott's mind. He then offers a general philosophy of gender-affirming care that insists on the lifelong parasitism and dependency of the trans woman patient. Scott says, the transsexual's difficulty is that he can't compete in a pretty difficult society, not only sexually, but generally. And it's obvious that the treatment is to accept dependency, not on his terms, but on ours, to help him. Not to cure him, but to attempt to get him to adapt in an easier and more controlled environment. If you must try surgery, try it. It probably helps sometimes, but it won't help on its own. After he's had his operation, you've got to keep helping him. So in the Q&A section, Erickson asked Scott how he considers this applicable to the genetic female who has been able to compete and who perhaps has been able to compete more adequately than a normal female. So in this question, Erickson states that the genetic female, by which he means the trans man in today's parlance, have been able to compete in the economic marketplace more successfully than both trans women and cisgender women. So from my position as a researcher, trying very hard to get some glimpse of Erickson's self-understanding among the archive that I've had available to me historically, I can't help but wonder if this is how Erickson saw himself, someone who possessed massive wealth, not only or even primarily from his considerable inheritance, but also his own exceptionalism in business. After all, in promotional materials for the EEF, Erickson is typically described first and foremost as a businessman. Erickson's possible self-fashioning as a uniquely capable economic competitor is something I'm interested in, and part of the ongoing process of trying to get a fuller picture of Erickson as a person. But I'm also, from a scholarly historical standpoint, very interested in the fact that this characteristic is defined against the figure of the non-competitive, economically unsuccessful trans woman. And this also is something that scholars have talked about, and I'll point back to a quote from Irving here, although there's other people who have talked about this. And this is, to be clear, this is not Dan Irving, this is John Money, and a quote from John Money, but I'll explain why. Irving in his article argues that in the post-World War II era, productive capacity and authentic masculinity were more closely linked than ever before. As a result, some clinical understandings of FTM transsexuals made increasingly apparent the connection between supposedly genuine maleness and productive capacity. Irving then quotes the sexologist John Money, pictured here, who stated that, this is part of the quote I've included here, whereas the gender coding of the male to female transsexual is prevalently that of the attention-attracting vamp, not the devoted Madonna, the masculine gender coding of the female to male transsexual is prevalently that of the reliable provider, not the profligate playboy. As Irving points out, this particular understanding advanced by Money naturalizes the devaluation of women and non-normative masculinities. So in response to Erickson's question, Scott says, I can only remember 3 or 4 female transsexuals I have been involved with. I can't say they are hyper successful, really. They've had masculine roles set for them and they have masculine aspirations, but they don't seem able to attain it. The ones I have dealt with are always considerably psychopathic as well. So a note about Scott's response here, his association of trans people, in this case, trans men, with psychopathy is also pretty par for the course of the academic world that you would have seen here. It was not unusual for trans people to be associated with psychopathy, narcissism, sociopathy, antisocial traits, right? This was a common claim made even by doctors who were considered more sympathetic to trans people than others. But what really strikes me about this answer, and the reason that it stayed in my head since I initially found this exchange some time ago, is just thinking about Erickson and what his experience must have been like in this moment. He's at a conference that he funded. His name does not appear in most of the promotional material for the conference. The organizers did send out publicity. They had a press conference. They published the name of attendees. Erickson was not on that list. I don't know if that was because he requested not to be or another reason, but he was not. And there's some archival evidence that even among transsexuality researchers who knew that he was the Erickson of the Erickson Educational Foundation, many of them did not know that he was trans. Judging on this response, I'm guessing Scott is one of those people. I think Scott would not say this about trans men if he knew he was talking to his millionaire trans boss, the head of his subfield, essentially, the main funder of his subfield, at least. And so, I think about this experience of Erickson's where he's kind of responded to Scott in such a way where he's kind of setting it up for Scott to affirm the exceptionalism of people like Erickson. And instead, he gets this response. I don't really have a scholarly analysis of that. It's just a scene that has really stuck with me. And it's part of why I think Erickson is such an interesting figure and one that I wanted to come here and learn more about. So for our next case study, we'll be talking about the group Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, which I'll be referring to as STAR for the rest of this presentation. STAR was founded in 1970 by two trans women pictured here. We have Marsha P. Johnson in the yellow dress here and Sylvia Rivera in the black dress next to her. Johnson and Rivera met in New York City, where Johnson was one of a number of older queer women in the kind of social orbit that Rivera found herself in after she was newly homeless following her family's rejection of her effeminacy and interest in women's clothing. Johnson and a few other elders informally adopted Rivera, helped her stay safe, find a community, find places to stay, etc. Eventually, they became, best friends and inseparable by many people's accounts. Before Johnson and Rivera ever formed an official organization together, they worked together informally to provide shelter and basic necessities to other queer and trans people in their community, doing things like renting out hotel rooms that they invited other folks experiencing homelessness to stay in with them, helping other folks gather funds for food, medicine, etc. This reliance on mutual aid and community protection was especially important for Rivera Johnson and their community members as they experienced near constant police harassment, chronic arrest, psychiatric imprisonment, and violence, including from cisgender gays and lesbians in the New York City queer scene. As Rivera summarized in a later interview, STAR was for the street gay people, the street homeless people, and anybody that needed help at the time. Before I get further into the formation of STAR, I want to mention that in my research so far, I've been able to find much more direct quotes from Rivera than I have of Johnson. By all accounts, STAR was very much a joint effort between the two, and I don't want the presence of primarily Rivera quotes here to suggest otherwise. Rather, the quotes that have been included are what I've been able to access so far in mostly online research. Soon I'll be able to do some more in-person research at a couple of STAR collections in New York, so hopefully I'll be able to get a fuller picture, but I wanted to just acknowledge that off the bat. So what's included here are STAR materials, manifestos, things like that kind of explain the organization's positions, and then quotes from Rivera. While Rivera and Johnson are both perhaps most well known today for their participation in the 1969 Stonewall Uprising, STAR was actually born out of a later incidence of police violence in 1970. Following the New York University administration's decision to cancel gay dances scheduled to take place in the university's Weinstein Hall, Rivera and Johnson joined a wide range of New York City queer groups in a 5-day sit-in of the building. I was not able to find any pictures of Johnson and Rivera together, although I know they were both there, probably hanging out together. But I was able to find these two pictures that I really love. We have Johnson over here holding a gay rights at NYU sign, and then we have Rivera here surrounded by a lot of other folks at the sit-in. On the 5th day of the sit-in, the university called upon the New York Police Department to bust up the protesters. In Rivera's telling, once the riot police arrived, some of the queer organizations that had organized the sit-in, predominantly white, middle-class groups, mostly composed of cisgender homosexuals, left relatively quickly. While the members of the sit-in, already most vulnerable to police harassment, trans feminine people of color, many of them homeless, stuck around to square off against the police. Rivera cited this moment of differing reactions to police presence as a catalyst for the formation of STAR. Resistance to law enforcement became a central theme of STAR's activities, unsurprising given the incredible frequency with which Johnson, Rivera, and their peers were subjected to arrest, sexual assault, and at times psychiatric imprisonment from NYPD officers. In STAR's first publication in 1970, the group makes clear that the fight for gay rights, an umbrella term used by STAR at that time to refer to people who we might now conceptualize as cis gay people and trans people of all orientations, would require organized opposition to police power. As Rivera put it in a later interview, we always felt the police were the real enemy. We expected nothing better than to be treated like animals, and we were. This attitude towards law enforcement officers differs greatly from the approach taken by EEF, which often formed collaborative relationships with law enforcement officers and provided funding to both individual officers like Elliot Blackstone, pictured in the middle there, from San Francisco, and criminologists who worked closely with police departments like Marie Mell, who was a longtime employee of the EEF. While divergences in attitudes towards law enforcement is not technically the focus of this presentation, I think it's a really important thing to highlight. For Rivera, law enforcement and doctors were not unrelated. Rather, they were two wings of a system that penalized gender expression, nonconformity, and poverty. As we'll see, differing attitudes towards law enforcement often tracked onto differing attitudes towards medical authorities. The first quote I want to get into from Rivera comes from a 1971 article she wrote in Come Out magazine entitled Transvestites, Your Half-Sisters and Half-Brothers of the Revolution. In the article, which is directed at non-trans members of the queer community, Rivera states, "We have lost our jobs, our homes, friends, family, because of lack of understanding of our valid lifestyle. They have been brainwashed by the system that has condemned us and by doctors that call us a disease and a bunch of freaks. Our family and friends have also condemned us because of their lack of true knowledge." I want to draw attention to the difference in how, from Erickson's earlier quote and Rivera, transness is conceptualized. Erickson describes transness as a condition that causes social non-cohesion, a disconnect between body and self, best remedied by medical intervention. Rivera identifies the source of trans discrimination as arising not from the supposed non-cohesion represented by the trans person, but the ignorance and brainwashing of non-trans people. Erickson viewed the medical establishment as a source of remedying societal transphobia, specifically through education and the provision of care, while Rivera describes doctors as unambiguous architects of this system of oppression. Of course, there are commonalities between how Rivera and Erickson viewed the predicament of trans people in the US. Both emphasized that there was a problem with education, with ignorance, and lack of understanding. I do think, however, that Rivera and Erickson proposed different remedies to ignorance and focused on different populations that needed to be to understand transness more. Erickson was invested in improving the understanding of people in positions of social power, like doctors, law enforcement officers, and clergy, while Rivera stated that trans people suffered especially from the ignorance of those with whom they were in closest relation, their family and friends. In this way, Erickson and many other trans people operative at this time with similar levels of proximity to the medical establishment proposed a top-down mode of education, while Rivera proposed a more lateral or transversal approach. Starr's position towards the medical establishment is most evident in their 1970 manifesto. The group calls for, among other things, the right to free physiological change and modification of sex on demand, and the end to all exploitative practices of doctors and psychiatrists who work in the field of transvestism. By calling for the establishment of gender-affirming care on demand, Starr is calling into question one of the most foundational tenets of transsexual medicine at the time, that to be trans is to have a condition, a mental condition, that inherently impairs your ability to make sound medical choices or sound large decisions in general. By calling for this care on demand, Starr is rejecting one of the underlying premises of institutional trans medicine as a professional field, right? And that premise is that the provision of gender-affirming care required a professional class of objective, non-trans practitioners whose chief function was to make sure that gender-affirming care was given out selectively and after a period of consideration, or what people call vetting. Transsexuality researchers at the time argued that preventing gender-affirming care on demand was an important form of protection for trans seekers of gender-affirming care, while critics and an increasing number of scholars pointed out that diagnostic and practical barriers serve to keep marginalized trans people, whether they be people of color, sex worker, or any range of non-productive citizens, from accessing care. Now, the question of whether or not gender-affirming care should be available on demand and the reasons that different communities have different opinions on the matter is much too much to get into here. But I'm emphasizing it for a few reasons. One, just to point out the contrast between the position taken by the EEF and that taken by Starr, but also to make a historiographical point about trans intellectual history. Some accounts of trans intellectual history, especially those concerned with the academic field of trans studies, often suggest that depathologization and the right to care on demand are intellectual developments that kind of occurred in the 1980s and 1990s, especially within the context of the academy. And as you know, an examination of the archive proves, that is just simply not true, right? That kind of position existed and was expressed forcefully and clearly, at least by 1970. I'm sure I'm sure there's evidence of it existing even earlier than that. And I would actually suggest that there were groups of individuals who were challenging the premises of transsexual medicine since the field's very inception. Let me see, I'm turning myself around a little bit. Okay, here we go. There's another aspect of the STAR Manifesto that I want to draw attention to, which is the part of item 1 highlighted here, the right to free dress and adornment. On one level, I want to point out that STAR is utilizing the language of individual rights here in a way that is very similar to the gay liberation movement, the women's movement, the civil rights movement of the time. This language of rights applied to gender-affirming care was not one that you would see often in the language of, folks like Erickson or some of the more mainstream transsexuality researchers of the time. In a lot of that language, you will see gender-affirming care talked about as something that is kind of benevolently extended, right? A method of alleviating suffering that is given compassionately. But very rarely do you, if ever, see the language of rights in those areas. Now, the idea that that is a right is something that is much more mainstream in trans politics. But I want to point out how different that was, and the fact that this really would have been considered fringe at the time, at least by some of the other folks active around this time. The other aspect I want to pay attention to is the right to free dress and adornment. So here, STAR is putting two things on equal footing: the right to access gender-affirming care, and I suggest, the right to dress as one wants, regardless of anything, regardless of whether or not you have access to gender-affirming care, whether or not people think that you pass, whether or not your particular mode of dress would be considered socially disruptive in any way. Again, this might seem obvious from our 2024 perspective, but I think it demonstrates an important difference between STAR and some other trans-led movements of the time. In much of this other literature directed at trans people, the burden for assimilation, for non-offensiveness, for blending in, was put on trans people themselves, both as a piece of practical advice to avoid employment discrimination, family rejection, and violence, but also, I argue, as part of the vision of gender-affirming care as a tool for greater social cohesion and economic productivity. The right to free dress and adornment flips this emphasis on social cohesion, instead calling on a right to expression, regardless of how it impacts other people. And then I included another quote here from Rivera, from an interview that happened in 2001, where I think she makes a similar point regarding employment protections. She says, the laws do not give us the right to go and get a job the way we feel comfortable. I do not want to go to work looking like a man when I know I am not a man, right? And here, Rivera is saying I should have the right to show up to my employment dressed in the way that I want to, regardless of how other people perceive it. At least that's how I interpret Rivera's quote here. One final point I want to make about STAR is to get back to the centrality of providing direct material assistance to community members. Folks might look at some of STAR's early activities, like raising funds to provide housing and everyday financial assistance to other trans people, and ask, that's great, but what does it have to do with gender-affirming care? To answer that question, we need to think about the practicalities of who was and who was not able to access official channels of gender-affirming care at this time, whether that be university gender clinics or private practice clinics like Benjamin's in New York and San Francisco. In recent years, there's been an increase in scholarship that points out that Benjamin's practice in particular was very selective of prospective patients, declining to offer care to patients who, in Benjamin and his colleagues' subjective assessment, were not likely to pass post-transition. As Beans Veloci has pointed out, and in this article I've included here, and other folks have as well, what this meant practically was that trans people of color, low-income trans people, and a range of people considered unlikely to pass for any number of reasons were much less likely to get psychiatric approval for gender-affirming care. which meant no entry into official clinical pathways. However, folks who were shut out of systems like university gender clinics or private practices still found ways to access gender-affirming care. And I've pointed out here a 2022 article from Jules Gill-Peterson that I think does a really good job of talking about this. And in the piece, Gill-Peterson recounts how trans women accessed hormone replacement therapy through a range of non-official means, developing individual and community expertise along the way to help each other do this safely. Similar efforts with varying levels of success were made to access surgery. In these scenarios, patients had to pay entirely out of pocket. Now, many folks at this time, even if you did have psychiatric approval, may have ended up needing to pay out of pocket. Many folks today still need to pay out of pocket, right? But if you were obtaining any of these things legally, you had absolutely no recourse to health insurance subsidies or any kind of government subsidized things, right? So in this sense, gender-affirming care becomes one of your other daily expenses. And I point this out to say that when we look at things like this wonderful archival piece from Star advertising an open house cake sale to raise money for the Star House, which provided shelter to queer and trans people who needed shelter, we might look at that and say, well, that doesn't have anything to do with gender-affirming care. That's about shelter, right? But if you think about somebody at that time who has a list of expenses and a finite amount of money, having something like your shelter taken care of may be the only way that you're able to pay for, hormone replacement therapy or surgery. So I say that to point out maybe we need to expand our list of activities that are legible as expanding access to gender-affirming care. Okay, I have one more group that I want to talk about, and that is the National Transsexual Counseling Unit that I'll refer to as the NTCU. There's a lot less documentation about the NTCU out there than there is about EEF and STAR. And what that means for this presentation is that the visuals are nowhere near as entertaining, so I apologize for that off the bat. The NTCU was a referral and information relay service staffed primarily by trans women, which existed in the Tenderloin neighborhood of San Francisco in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Over its existence, the NTCU helped trans women gain psychiatric referrals for gender-affirming care, as well as running educational, job training, and various self-help programs. Along with a number of government anti-poverty grants at the beginning of its run, NTCU was also funded by grants from the Erickson Foundation. I chose to highlight NTCU in this presentation because I think it represents a really fascinating clash of differing attitudes towards professionalism, medicalization, and the role of trans people in grassroots effort to expand access to care. The origins of NTCU are in a series of support groups and activist collectives formed amongst trans women sex workers in the Tenderloin as early as 1966. And if you're interested in this, I think I forgot to throw the article up there, but there's a wonderful article by members of the Gay and Lesbian Historical Society of Northern California. I believe it's called History in the Trans Tenderloin or something like that. And along with Susan Stryker's Transgender History, it's one of the very few sources of secondary scholarship on the NTCU. So I would definitely check those out if you're interested. And that is how I know these very few concrete details I do know. So it starts with this series of support groups, collectives among trans women sex workers in the Tenderloin as early as 1966. By 1968, this group had split into two factions, one led by Louise Ergastrasse, who Stryker describes as possessing a, quote, orientation towards transgender street subcultures, and one led by Wendy Kohler, described by Stryker as possessing an, quote, upwardly mobile assimilationist mindset. Stryker doesn't offer a lot of detail in transgender history about how she came to these two characterizations of Kohler and Ergastrasse, but I really like that quote because I think it tracks on to some of these fault lines that we're seeing in terms of economic citizenship, employment, whatnot, around this time of trans history in the US. Ergastrasse's organization, she's the one who was orientated towards street subcultures, folded within a year, while Kohler teamed up with a somewhat unlikely figure who ended up serving as the NTCU's on-paper director for most of its run. San Francisco Police Department Sergeant Elliot Blackstone. So this is a picture of Blackstone receiving some commendation towards the end of his life. Blackstone became the San Francisco Police Department's first liaison to the homophile community, as it was called, because of his interest in community policing. He reportedly became interested in people seeking access to gender-affirming care in the Tenderloin after Ergastrasse stormed into his office, slammed a copy of Benjamin's Transsexual Phenomenon onto his desk, and demanded that he do something for her people. Now, there's some differing arguments about what actually happened in that meeting, but that's kind of Blackstone's account of the event. In an oral history interview with Stryker, Blackstone explained that a large part of his job as NTCU director was acting as a go-between for trans patients and medical providers. Asked by Stryker if there was ever tension between trans people and medical providers, Blackstone responded, yeah, there was tension. There was tension because, spoken in a childish sing-song voice, they won't give me what I want. I want hormones. They won't give me hormones. I want surgery. They won't give me surgery. They want me to be psychoanalyzed. They didn't do what the doctors wanted them to do. Part of my job was to make them realize that what the doctor was doing was what they needed. They don't tell the doctor what to do. The doctor tells them how to get to where they want to go. In this quote, we see a pretty straightforward rejection from Blackstone of the position towards medical authority and care on demand, articulated at just about the same time by Starr in their manifesto and by other folks. And we also see accounts from him that this feeling of resisting the vetting processes, the diagnostic and treatment protocols already operative at the time, was something that, an increasing number of people were openly expressing. And Blackstone comes pretty clearly, on the side of the medical practitioners in that sense. Sometime in or around 1969, the details are a little hazy, NTCU receives a grant from the Erickson Foundation. Kohler was mentioned frequently in EEF newsletters alongside descriptions of seminars offered by NTCU. In these seminars, we see a similar emphasis on job training, courses in gender role adjustment, and deference to medical authority. One of the most interesting kind of archival pieces that I found is this piece from a 1970 EEF newsletter on the side here, which says, contrary to the growing women's liberation movement tenets, is the transsexual's preoccupation with grooming femininity and jobs compatible with the new gender. NTCU counseling coordinator Catherine Ricks commented, "We're second place. We have to try harder." I think this quote does a really good job of explaining that feeling and that emphasis on economic competition once more, and explaining that, at least in the feelings of Ricks here, there is an absolute imperative to fashion oneself in a way to gain employment. And during this time, being able to show legitimate employment was often one of the requirements for being able to access gender-affirming care from a lot of the official pathways. And NTCU here is kind of, along with all the seminars provided, one of its functions was a space to encourage that. And I'm going to go fairly quickly through the history of the NTCU here. I'm very interested in this, and there's a lot of details, but unfortunately, there's very little archival information. So I'll just point out some of the little tidbits I do have. Kohler's time at the NTCU ended in 1970 or 71. It seems like this is the same time when the first grant from the Erickson Foundation ran out, and the government funding that they had been getting specifically for job training programs also ran out. So at this point, NTCU has a lot less money and it has a lot less staff. There's kind of a rotating collection of volunteers, but eventually it settles on Suzanne Cook and, oh, sorry, let me go back here a little bit. It eventually settles on Suzanne Cook and Jan Maxwell as the two trans women who are essentially running it for this period in 1970 and 1971. This is the period, 1971 to roughly 1972. This is the period of the NTCU I'm most interested in, and it's also the one that has some of the least information about it. one of the few sources of information I do have is a really massive oral history interview with Suzanne Cook that Susan Stryker conducted in the 90s and was generous enough to make available online through the LGBT Historical Society of Northern California, I believe. And so I have a lot of Cook's perspective and none of Maxwell's perspective. I would love to be able to hear Maxwell's take on this time, but sometimes people maybe don't want to sit down for massive oral history interviews, which is completely understandable. I find Cook to be a very fascinating character. Like many other white trans women who came to call San Francisco home in the 60s, Cook came to the city after becoming estranged from her East Coast family for her gender transgression and perceived queerness. Once in the city, she became deeply involved in the countercultural scene and began taking classes on feminism at Berkeley, although she did not obtain a bachelor's there. Cook tells Stryker a story of visiting the NTCU sometime in the 60s before she worked there. And Cook was really put off by her interactions with Kohler and some of the other women who worked there. And again, I don't have Kohler's perspective on this exchange or this situation, but I do have Cook's perspective, which I think is interesting. Cook felt that Kohler and the other women at the NTCU were, quote, trying to break me into total femininity, total womanhood. Cook describes the women's attitude as, if you're transsexual, if you're a real transsexual, then what your goal should be is to get the surgery. If you must work, you should work at a traditional woman's job, but your real goal should be to get married and have a husband, maybe adopt children and settle down into suburbia and never, ever tell anybody about you. So in this, paraphrase of Kohler's position that Cook offers, which again, we don't know how Kohler would remember that interaction. It's expressing this view that, the goal of transition of gender-affirming care should be, passing completely and kind of disappearing into a more normative, U.S. American life. And Cook, along with a lot of other trans women in San Francisco at the time, was really involved in a lot of politics and a lot of social movements that were making kind of the opposite argument, right? She was really involved with like radical lesbian organizing in the city, radical feminist organizing. She had worked with Students for Democratic Society, and she describes herself at some other point in the piece as this radical feminist chick from Berkeley who just goes there and feels like people are just trying to make her completely normative. So Cook leaves this, and she doesn't end up accessing services through NTCU because she's basically just really not interested in that vision of trans femininity. So it's interesting why Cook does eventually take a job at NTCU if she had such a negative reaction. One of the reasons she cites is her friendship with Jan Maxwell, who started working at NTCU before her. Cook spoke very highly of Maxwell and says that they had a lot of the same political commitments. She respected Maxwell, so she thought, okay, if Jan's here, it's going to make it a little bit better. But the most kind of pressing reason that Cook accepted a job at NTCU was her own journey in trying to access gender-affirming surgery through the Stanford Gender Clinic. So Cook was in a unique position among the trans women in the Tenderloin in that she had enough money to pay the out-of-pocket fees for the surgery, which she got through a very lucrative career in some of the vice economies in San Francisco. And she had also, she doesn't quite go into detail about how this happens, but she gives the impression that she had passed some of the first subjective assessments at the gender clinic. Cook being white, high school educated, being judged to pass by many people, right, had a lot of the characteristics that would have helped her get through a system like that. But there was one thing Cook did not have, and that was proof of legitimate employment. So Cook had the money, but she could not put down how she got the money on the forms for the Stanford people, right? So one of the things they told her is, okay, if you get a straight job, as they called it, that will help you. So that was one of the reasons that Cook accepted the job. And I think it's a really interesting example of all the different things you had to have lined up to get approved by one of these systems, right? You could imagine somebody else who had the legitimate employment but didn't have the money that Cook had, right? Maybe had legitimate employment and had the money that Cook had, but was judged to be unlikely to pass post-surgery. And we do have evidence that those folks were often rejected. So, this gives us, I think, some insight into some of the reasons that trans folks may have found themselves working at places that, perhaps they didn't have complete ideological alignment with. I am a graduate student at a university that I do not have complete ideological alignment with, so I definitely, understand that. So as co-workers at NTCU, Cook and Maxwell undertake a combination of activities that retain some of the tasks undertaken by Kohler, along with some more informal, direct means of helping trans people in the neighborhood. Interestingly, Cook and Maxwell give a large number of lectures to the San Francisco Police Academy, attempting to educate officers about transsexuality and advocating for the decriminalization of cross-dressing, which is something that Blackstone was also involved with. On the more informal side, Cook and Maxwell wrote to tons and tons of people, giving them advice. This is the quote here, telling them where to go, compiling lists of doctors, local doctors in various major cities around the country, holding hands, went to check on people after they got out of the hospital, making sure that they were able to take care of themselves, helping them get through it, literally teaching them how to do it. So I think this part of the interview is interesting because you see a mix of some of these activities that are really in keeping with the Erickson Foundation, this desire to kind of educate law enforcement officials to develop a presence in some of these more kind of institutional locales. And then some of the mutual assistance everyday things that we see from, organizations like STARS or other organizations. And from what I've been able to tell, the engagements with the police academy, there's no evidence that the Erickson Foundation was like telling them they had to do it. Cook says elsewhere in the interview that the Erickson Foundation was pretty hands-off. They had to, show that they were fulfilling the remit of the grant and whatnot, but generally there was not a micromanagement. And, the EF mostly paid for the rent on their small office and typewriters, and nobody was making a fortune off of this. The other aspect of Cook's interview that I find really interesting is her attitude towards medicalization and the role of vetting in access to gender-affirming care. At many points, her attitude seems contradictory. I also think if any of us were to speak for 40 pages worth, we would probably seem pretty contradictory. I know that I would, so this is not surprising. But in some places, Cook seems to echo this feeling, this criticism of the medical establishment's reliance on vetting procedures, and suggests that desire for surgery should be sufficient proof of one's transsexuality. So we see this quote here where she's talking about medical practitioners, and she says, they'd say the transsexuals have prepared themselves for the questions you're going to ask them. It was like we were being so dishonest or something, right? Because we'd lie, which just flies in the face of logic. See some of that frustration. But at other points, Cook does seem to support the idea that people seeking access to gender-affirming care ought to be asked to satisfy some degree of psychological vetting in order to access that care. In fact, Cook and Maxwell began offering unofficial red tagging services for a nonprofit gender-affirming care center in San Francisco called Fort Help. The Center for Special Problems. Cook and Maxwell would sift through the application materials of individuals seeking access to gender-affirming care and set aside those who, in their opinion, needed further psychological vetting before being given access to that care. Cook does not offer many details about the exact criteria that she and Maxwell used to make these decisions. However, some of her comments suggest that she may have red tagged two individuals, one who Cook felt would be unlikely to pass as a woman post-transition, and one who Cook judged to be mentally unstable. So this is a really interesting part of the interview that I wish I had more information about. I wish there were records of this decision process so we could try to see what kind of patterns. I don't think those records exist. Perhaps I'm wrong. But I think it demonstrates the kind of complexity and ambivalence and conflictedness that existed at this time among some trans facilitators of gender-affirming care. But also the fact that, reading oral history interviews from this time, it was pretty common to see trans folks speak about others with almost like a feeling of a gut understanding of who should access care and who should not. And that is, a really interesting aspect of these interviews I've been able to read that I'm still wrestling with. And kind of like my earlier scene from Erickson, I don't know if I definitely don't have a settled academic point on that. It's just something that I find really fascinating and think about a lot. Cook recounts that her and Maxwell eventually faced some real blowback from their community once word got out that they were doing this. She says it caused quite a little tempest in a teapot. Interestingly, in Cook's recollection, the reason people were upset was not only that she was serving this vetting role in particular, but that she was doing it without psychiatric credentials. So again, we don't have materials or haven't been able to find them of somebody who was rejected by Cook. I would love to be able to ask somebody who was rejected, what they thought of the situation, but we don't have that. But in Cook's recollection, the criticism had to do with the fact that she and Maxwell did not have degrees. And I think this also gestures towards some interesting tensions with professionalization and education level. Cook talks in the interview about how she was very aware of the fact that her high school diploma and her limited amount of undergrad education did kind of set her apart from a lot of the other trans women in the Tenderloin, and in fact was one of the reasons she was able to get the job at NTCU and afterwards gain approval for surgery in the first place. So she had an awareness of having this kind of educational differential. However, around this time, there's starting to be some other trans women in the Tenderloin, like Laura Cummings, who worked with Jill Fort, who did have undergraduate degrees in psychology. I think Cummings eventually got a master's. And Cummings would give people conflicting advice from what Cook would say. And there was kind of a ceiling for Cook of how far she could go in this world without those credentials. Eventually, NTCU functionally shuts down because Cook and Maxwell are arrested by the San Francisco PD, basically in an entrapment case for cocaine possession. So that is a very interesting story that I decided I did not have time to go into. But if you want to learn more about that, you can check out the oral history interview. It's available online from the LGBT Historical Society of Northern California. And that is the end of my presentation. So I really appreciate your attention as I talked about these very differing groups. And I hope that at the very least, it gives us some food for thought to maybe reconsider what we thought we knew about the experiences of trans people in this time period involved in any way with helping other trans people access gender-affirming care. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you for speaking to us. Folks at home, folks here, if you like what we do, please come back for more. And we do all kinds of things like this, lots of programming throughout the year. This is just one of many things that we do to support trans people and our allies who are looking for information and community and history. So please help us to continue to do this important work. Contrary to what almost everybody thinks, the chair in transgender studies is not an endowed chair. Our survival depends on the goodwill from the University of Victoria, where we sit right now, and on donations from our supporters. So if you're able, please donate now. You can scan the QR code on the screen. You can click on the link that's in your chat window. And if you're unable to donate now, maybe sometime in the future. And if you know anybody else who is able to donate, please encourage them to support us so that we can do more of the wonderful things that we are doing now. Follow us on social media, and we'll see you next time. Thank you so much for coming today.